What occurs when the loudest voice in the room is silence? Something happened that no record dared to express in 1841, deep in the Virginia marshes, when a woman without words started rewriting history with fire and poison. Was it retaliation, or something older peering through her eyes as a locked house, a missing girl, and a family erased by their own walls came into view? Remain with us. It's more than a ghost story. This is an accountability. Should you wish to ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right once and enable notifications. Follow true stories that transcend time and uncover hidden realities. The huge estate of Hollow Creek Plantation, a place of rotting splendor and deteriorating power, situated in the fog-choked valleys of antebellum Virginia, where the air was heavy with the smell of pine and tobacco. Along the dusty route to Roanoke, the property was inconspicuous to horseback riders. One further example of Southern pride, complete with its opulent home rows of dying cotton fields and the skeletal ruins of a long-defunct sugarcane mill, may be found at the top of the hill. However, Hollow Creek meant something completely different to those who tilled its land while enslaved. It was a mouth that ate stillness, buried secrets in its belly, and swallowed the past. Alistair Westcott, a former judge who became a plantation tycoon and was renowned for his extreme austerity and superstitious practices, owned the estate. A powerful man, Wayne Scott, who was a devout Presbyterian, performed daily prayers at dawn, insisted on ceremonial penalties at sunset, and believed that suffering was the best way to maintain order. Letitia, his wife, was hardly ever heard, above a whisper, and was frequently spotted pacing the upstairs hallways while holding a rosary that was made of ash wood and wrapped in leather rather than being Catholic. All of their kids had passed away in infancy. Some claimed to be ill, while others hinted at something more serious. By 1841, the residents had just the couple and their small group of family members and visitors who visited less often every year. Mary was one of the slaves. No family history, no known location of birth, and no last name. Sometime around 1833, she was recorded in Wayne Scott's inventory books as a girl, mute, and assigned to kitchen labor. Years later, it was her perseverance, not her origins, that attracted notice. Carrying baskets of herbs, salves, and kettles, she walked through the corridors like a shadow, silent as stone. Nobody remembered her ever saying anything, not even in the quarters among the others. But her eyes seemed too alert for someone who claimed to be tongueless. And she listened, always listened. Mary was able to gain entrance because of her invisibility, which came from her silence. She brewed teas for the Reverend's occasional visits, made medicines for Mrs. Waynecott's anxieties, and was permitted to go into town once a month with the overseer's daughter, always 5 paces behind. She brought paper back, strange small, volumes written in languages the Wainscott could not read, dried flowers, and packages of medication. She stored these under the pantry floorboards in a secret alcove. It was never searched. Nobody ever considered doing so. She was borne wide by the other oppressed laborers. She was feared by some and revered by others. One elderly guy reportedly murmured, "She walks with the stillborn," before being lashed for being intoxicated. Moreover, a small child named Elijah claimed to have seen Mary conversing with a figure near the swamp's edge who was obscured by fog. He denied it when questioned, although he later forbade approaching the cookhouse. A black woman without a mouth would cause him to wake up in the middle of the night and cry. Mary never caused any problems in spite of this. She never seemed to tire, never hesitated in her responsibilities, and always followed instructions. Wayne barely raised his hand to her once, and only then did he accuse her of tampering, using a salve that made his gout worse. When he hit her, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. However, 2 days later, his dog was discovered dangling from a tree with blackened paws and missing eyes. Wayncott never touched her again, but he remained silent. The plantation entered a state of silent decay around the beginning of 1841. Crops didn't work out. The water in the well became brackish. Visitors paused traveling. At night, some people reported seeing a pale flame flickering in the windows of the second story. Others heard a sweet, wordless tune spoken in a woman's voice who shouldn't have had one. The girl is included as the final item in the Wayne Scott family ledger, which is scrolled in a hurried, shaking hand. She is not who she appears to be. This place contains things that predate Christ. The ink then disappears from the page, as though the hand that wrote it was abruptly and mercilessly interrupted. There were spots in Hollow Creek where the oppressive silence was so strong that even the sun would not touch them. The attic, with its twisted rafters and rows of dark and mildew-covered furniture. It was reported that at night, the root cellar, which was dug into the ground like a grave, would murmur. Mary, however, was the center of the stillness. She wasn't just silent. She was a physical manifestation of absence. There was no echo from her presence, and the sound of her footsteps was as gentle as dust. The slaves at Hollow Creek were able to communicate in code by 1841, and their eyes were as keen as knives. Rather than being reactive, punishments have become more ceremonial and ritualized. Wayne's gut had started performing what he termed cleansings, which were always preceded by prayer and involved coerced confessions, followed by daybreak lashings. He asserted that he sensed a sinister presence encroaching on the house from the outside. He was blind to the fact that it had never entered through the gates. Among them it had always resided. Mary never altered her daily schedule. Gather herbs from the moist edges of the marsh, grind them in a stone mortar beside the fireplace, tend to Letitia's tantrums, make bread, and serve in quiet. Get up before the rooster. Her gaze never lingered long enough to miss anything. After each sermon, she saw Waistcott's hands shake. She observed that when he sat by himself, his breath had a coppery odor. Gazing into the fire in the study, she observed the way Letitia's fingers moved while she slept, gripping intangible beads and muttering names that were no longer living. Older women in the quarters claimed that Mary had deeper, older roots that were buried in blood and lum, rather than just African ancestry. Beneath her dress, she had a purse around her neck. It smelled like bitter iron and was stitched shut with strands of her own hair. Nobody ventured to inquire about its contents. Clara Ara, a youngster, became unwell one stormy night. Her skin grew as pale as wax as the fever raged. The overseer dismissed it as a wasting illness and declined to contact a doctor. Unasked, Mary slipped into the child's hut. She set a bowl of dark tea near Clara Ara's mouth, dabbed at her forehead with oil-wrapped leaves, and sat there till daybreak, humming a beat without melody that chilled the others. In the morning, the fever had fractured. Although no one expressed gratitude, they started to view her in a different light after that. The tales grew. According to one man, she was standing in the graveyard at night, surrounded by crows that remained. According to another, she entered the swamp, vanished for an hour, and then reappeared with a bundle of moss that smelt like burnt sugar and dry as bone. According to a third, she once placed her palm against the large belly of a cow, and 3 hours later, the animal gave birth to a calf with a human-shaped mark on its shoulder and a white eye, with her own ghosts haunting. Her, Letitia Waincott, started talking to Mary frequently, but not in orders, but rather in inquiries. She inquired about the sulfurous odor by the fireplace, the thumping in the walls, and dreams. Although Mary never responded, her silence was a response in and of itself. The voices then began to speak. Behind closed doors, servants started to hear whispers that were not in English or any African language. They are aware of it. It was weeping at moments, chanting at others. According to one field worker, during full moons, the pantry's walls leaked sap. Another reported seeing a man sitting by the piano at night, playing with immobile hands, wearing a preacher's coat. Something in the house had altered, as if it were breathing now, shallow and languid, as if it were waiting. But Mary stayed the same. The air became more dense. Mirrors started to break for no apparent reason. Food went bad before it could be served, and even when the family was asleep in the dead of night, footsteps could be heard on the top floor. Letitia was the first to lose her temper. During dinner, she yelled and accused Mary of mentally poisoning her, screaming, "You dream in me," she said. Wayne Scott hit her to silence as she said, "You've put things in my mouth when I sleep." Mary just stared at her, her head tilted slightly, her eyes calm, as if she were listening to something that no one else could hear. In order to re-establish order and look into what he called the infestation, Wayne called in 2 of his Tennessee cousins the same week. These men had dark pasts and darker intents. The cousins were scheduled to arrive the next Sunday, the same day Mary started making a brand new tea that no one had ever tried. The scent of wood and gun oil filled the air. Ellis and Thaddeus Westcott, who were related by blood but not by temperament, arrived on horseback, clothed in despite the heat. They wore black frock coats and had river dirt on their boots. Ellis was older, his eyes yellowed and hardly blinking, his face chiseled with distrust. Younger but more erratic, Thaddeus kept a whip with him for anyone he thought needed a reminder of their position, not for cattle. Neither man inquired. They thought they had the answers already. With the warmth of a man clinging to the last vestiges of authority, Alistair Winscott greeted them. He murmured about invisible things over brandy, things shifting through the rafters, his wife's unexpected tantrums, and a voiceless girl who appeared to be tearing apart his home piece by piece. Elias listened calmly, like a hunter. Thaddeus grinned. "Witchcraft is just ignorance with a face," he whispered. Mary didn't bat an eye. "Let me watch her for a day, and I'll wring the truth from her bones." With the same quiet poise, she served each of them, her hands solid as stone. Letitia demanded a fancy dinner that evening. With its candelabrum of molten wax and dim lighting from sconces, the dining room seemed too big and empty. Although the fireplace crackled, the chill that crept behind the walls was not warmed by the flames. Mary laid the table rather ceremoniously. Cornbread, glazed carrots, roast duck, and a special tea made with chamomile, clove, bloodroot, and another ingredient no one could identify, plus her own assortment of dried herbs. Without being asked, she poured. Without suspicion, the visitors drank. The tone of the conversation darkened. Aya related how a preacher had been discovered with his eyes sewn shut with horsehair while dangling from the rafters of his own church on a nearby estate. According to Thaddeus, a fugitive slave woman was burned alive after allegedly cursing a whole household. However, weeks later, the family passed away in their sleep, one by one with faces twisted with pain. According to Thaddeus, fear deceives people. Letitia's eyes were wide and unfocused, and she said nothing. Alistair's knuckles were white against the silverware, and he appeared pale. As usual, Mary stood invisible behind them all. The coughing started then. Letitia first whispered into her handkerchief. A trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth was followed by Elias getting harder. Thaddeus got up to talk, but staggered, clutching the table's edge as his vision swam. Alistair's legs gave down under him as he attempted to stand. There was panic. The candle blew out. Letitia fell to the ground, muttering a name that was not her own. Elias toppled a decanter as he slumped backward. Mary was out of the room when Thaddeus reached for her. One by one, doors slammed and windows sealed as though they had been handled by hands without wind. The wallpaper's margins were licked by the excessively high fire in the fireplace. A piano that had not been played in years started to play somewhere upstairs. It was the same quiet melody Mary had sang over Clara Ara's bed. The entrance door was barred from the inside when Alistair crawled approaching it. Bolts of heavy iron slid into position. The floorboards began to smell of smoke. With a gasp, Elias scratched at his own throat. Thaddeus yelled for his handgun. In his trembling palms, it misfired. The breeze outside changed. Nothing out of the ordinary was seen to those in the quarters, save for the slightest glimmer coming from the large house's windows. Behind curtains, a warm, flickering light resembled lanterns, but nobody moved. Nobody came over. A figure was observing from the swamp's edge, wearing simple clothing with her arms by her sides and fire-like eyes. Some claimed she smiled, while others vowed she disappeared before the home caught fire and the music continued inside the walls. Not all of the home burned at once. It started out slowly and methodically, as if it had also been waiting for this evening. The first to catch was the heavy mahogany paneling by the fireplace, which crackled and hissed like a living creature. The fire flickered over the ceiling of the dining room with artificial elegance, dancing around pictures as though choosing what to eat and avoiding the chandelier. The guys within, however, were not so lucky. Once a judge, Alistair Westcott now dragged himself over the marble floor while spitting blood and bile. He cried out for Letitia, for God, for anything, as the smoke became thicker. However, the barriers muffled his speech. His wife was slouched in her high-backed chair, muttering to someone she alone could see, her eyes wide and mouth gaping. With his pupils blown wide, Elas squirmed on the floor, clutching at the air as if he were drowning. In a fit of uncertainty and fury, Thaddeus slammed the butt of his gun at the windows, but the glass did not shatter, not even crack. Outside, the slaves stood silent, not out of fear, but more out of amazement. The large house, the center of the estate, the source of orders and punishment, had long dominated Hollow Creek. It was now consuming itself from the inside out. Among the older women, Ruth muttered. She shut the gates. Nobody inquired about her identity. The house moaned inside. There was the finality of a coffin lid when doors that had creaked now slammed shut. The door to the kitchen bolted on its own. The pantry lock shattered after twisting. A dense black smoke drifted from beneath Mary's former sleeping quarters, darkening the corridor upstairs. However, she wasn't there. She was everywhere, even though no one had seen her since dinner. With his lips scorched from the poisoned tea, Thaddeus started yelling prayers, not from the Bible, but twisted snippets, as though he were trying to talk over a whisper in his ear. He repeatedly used his knife to carve a cross into the dining table until the blade broke. Elias started laughing, softly at first, then hysterically, and sobbing in between breathless gasps. He repeated himself. Alistair, wheezing, pulled himself to the study and said, "Hole!" The name of the plantation itself had become a curse. On the desk where his last entry had trailed off, the family ledger was still open. His hand spasmed as he attempted to write again, to leave some record, any confession. Before the pen could scribble a word, the page was soaked with blood. Then there was a reverberation in the corridors, nor shouting nor fire. It was buzzing. From the upper floor came the quiet, low voice of a woman. The piano had played the same tune. It was the same song Mary had sang since she was a young girl. Thaddeus stopped. He squealed, "She's upstairs!" However, his legs gave out when he attempted to run. The ground underneath him became as supple as damp mud, gulping down one of his boots. Clawing to keep above the boards, he yelled. The stairwell had disappeared, sucked up by fire or something else, yet Elas crept toward the steps, pulling his shattered corpse behind him. A faraway bell rang outside. Such a bell was not possessed by anyone at Hollow Creek. Letitia stood abruptly, her garments still blazing. Her eyes were a brilliant white. Her mouth opened, and she whispered in Mary's voice, not her own. "This house remembers. The wind shifted. The curtains caught fire. The great chandelier fell, scattering silver and bone on the table below. Then, the first scream that sounded truly inhuman came from the parlor. By morning, the house was reduced to scorched earth and blackened beams, with nothing salvageable left. In less than an hour, the local magistrate, who had never been on Hollow Creek, approved the report, which stated that it was an electrical fire, even though it was 1841 and no part of the estate had ever seen a wire or spark other than from a lantern. No survivors, no investigation. A single wooden rosary carved from ash wrapped in leather was found next to a burned chair that had not collapsed. She did it. Mary's name was never on any manifest, nor in the inventory logs recovered from the ashes. The wainscot line ended that night. The enslaved were sold off in pieces, broken families dispersed to other plantations, names scrubbed from records and voices swallowed by generations. However, among them, a rumor took root. Not spoken, openly, not shared with outsiders, just a whisper passed in the hush of dusk. A descendant of the overseer claimed to have seen Mary walking calmly and barefoot away from the fire into the trees. But when pressed, he recounted, "It must have been smoke." The family Bible was also destroyed, though the iron lock on its case remained intact. The entry had been purposefully and neatly torn out, as if it had never existed. The area where Hollow Creek previously stood had returned to forest by the early 20th century, with trees growing over the foundations as the years and decades went by. When a group of researchers from Richmond arrived in 1903 to survey the land, for a proposed railroad, one of them, a young archaeologist named Nathaniel Crisp, had diaries that were later recovered from his estate. Locals avoided the area because of the vines that covered what little stone remained. Hunters who ventured too close complained of nausea and hearing footsteps behind them in leafless woods. One woman claimed her dog disappeared near the old well and returned 2 days later, her hair white and her eyes milky as glass. They discovered human bones, shallowly buried, curled in a fetal position beneath layers of moss and stone while digging near the edge of the overgrown swamp. But instead of the skeleton, Nathaniel wrote, what unsettled them was what accompanied it: a bundle of dried herbs, a pouch sewn shut with hair, and in the grasp of one brittle hand, a spoon, silver, bent unnaturally. She was positioned deliberately and reverently, as though someone knew this location would eventually be discovered. The remains' identities were never made public. There was no gravestone placed. However, the pouch is still there, hidden away in the Richmond Historical Society's archive. No one has ever opened it. The records also show that the fabric surrounding it never deteriorates. Regarding the terrain, the railroad was re-roofed. Following a number of unexplained injuries and one fatality, construction was suspended indefinitely. As he plummeted beneath a crumbling scaffold, an engineer reportedly cried a lullaby that everyone claimed to recognize but had never heard before. The villagers still refer to it as Dead Hollow. Youngsters challenge one another to take a moonlit stroll down the old road. Some return with tales to tell. Some never return at all. Additionally, locals claim to see a woman standing at the edge of the swamp on misty mornings. She is immobile. She doesn't talk. However, if you listen carefully, you may hear a gentle, wordless song that sounds like a memory that never belonged to you, just beneath the rustle of books and the murmur of the cicadas.